from the Isha Upanishad, tracing the philosophical vision of Sri Aurobindo. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the background of this book. So, firstly, the Upanishads themselves, there's a lot of controversy over actual historical dating of these things. But still, I'll draw out a mainstream history. And the idea is that the first wisdom literature of India and maybe of the world is the Veda. And Vedic writings, the early Rig Veda, Samhita, the hymns, are supposed to be from around the 1500 BC. And so that was the period when this kind of literature was written, and it became part of the social fabric of the times. We don't know exactly how long it took to move from a religious literature to a socialized symbolic form. See, because it became the way in which society was structured. Particularly the last volume of the Rig Veda, which is the 10th, it's got 10 volumes called mandalas. The 10th volume contains a hymn, which is a really important hymn, called the Purusha Sukta, which, it speaks about the sacrifice of the Purusha. Purusha can be translated loosely as person. So it is, in that sense, a kind of a theistic text, that reality is a person. Some people call it an anthropocentric text. In other words, reality is a human being. But it's not really a human being, it's really a much more plural being that has some relationship with the human being. But in any case, there is the sacrifice of that being. That being asks the gods to sacrifice it. And that sacrifice divides it into 4 parts. There's many other kinds of things. The seasons, the animals, the creatures. But there's also a 4-part division of the body of Purusha that is defined in terms of what we today call the castes. Brahmana, which means the men of wisdom, the Kshatriyas, who are the men of power, the Vaishyas, who are the people who are professional and also who do exchange of all kinds, and the Sudras, who are the workers. So this idea of who they are is actually not mentioned in the Rig Veda. It doesn't tell you who these people are. It just mentions the names. And the fact that society has been structured like that may or may not have been the case from the time it was written. One possibility is that it already reflects a social situation. Another possibility is it reflects a symbolic idea that was later translated into society. Whatever be the case, by the time of the Buddha, which is about the 5th century BC, we know that there was definitely a social stratification, division of society into these castes. And the Buddha is reacting to that. So he's looking for a way to go out of the system because he sees its hierarchic, oppressive, possibilities and what it's done to society. But the Buddha is not the first. I mean, a lot of people think that the Buddha is the first person who reacts against this. There is a revision of this idea that is going on long before that. And so the Upanishads can be thought of as a reform movement within the Vedic system, within the Brahmanical system itself. And if we are to date it, we could say that early Upanishads begin from around the 8th century BC. And when what we call the earliest Upanishads, they are the Brihadaranyaka and the Chandogya Upanishads. They are very large, not very systematic compilations of a certain kind of literature that even the very name Brihat Aranyaka literally means the vast forest. And these Aranyakas are Vedic texts that are arising from the time of the early Rig Veda Samhita that are interpreting to some extent the ideas of the Vedas in terms of wisdom, because the forests are the places where people go to develop inner understanding of what these texts are all. So they're sort of happening at the periphery of society. So it's very possible that the early Upanishads are really a way by which some of the teachings of the Aranyakas are being compiled and are becoming the recognition of a reformed system. And it's also possible that the later Upanishads may not really be in alignment with the Veda completely. Today we call the Upanishads Vedanta, which means the end of the Veda. But it doesn't necessarily mean that this is how the Upanishads saw themselves. It could also be a later revisionary move to connect the Upanishads to the Veda. I say this because in the Upanishads there's a lot of critical thinking about and even against the Veda. Certainly it is a different kind of way to approach the teachings of the Veda in terms of the ritual and social aspects that are represented by the Veda. So early Vedas, early Upanishads, as I say, are much more sprawling. They are in prose and they are less organized. By the time we come to the Isha Upanishad, this is a very different kind. The ideas, some of the ideas are the same as that of the early Upanishads, but it's a very kind of different form of literature. It's extremely condensed. So what we have is 18 verses. Firstly, it's a verse, it's poetic. Secondly, it's extremely condensed. It's just 18 verses. And so Upanishads of that kind are probably taking place much later. They're probably happening, there's difference of opinion as to whether they are before the Buddha or after the Buddha. They could be post-Buddhist. They could be pre-Buddhist, but just a little before the Buddha. So we are not really sure how to date something like the Isha Upanishad. We could consider it to be somewhere maybe 6th century BC or thereabouts. Now the thing that we are noticing about these Upanishads is that as a reform movement, they are not really addressed to the people inside society. They are like the forest texts, they belong to the periphery of society. And it is very possible that this is really the foundation of what we call the early Guru-shishya parampara, the tutelage between gurus and their disciples. Because Upanishad, see, in a way, early Indian literature actually is what we call eponymous. In other words, it names itself. So Veda literally means knowledge. So we consider Veda and try to derive meaning out of it, and there is an attempt to do that. And Sri Aurobindo is one of the people who has done that, who has tried to give a sense of what the Veda is talking about as a symbol system of symbols. But in any case, it is considered to be embodied knowledge. That's why it's called Veda. Upanishad literally means to sit close. And if you compare it to the word Veda, you already see a difference. The difference between something which is the knowledge and something which is sitting close to knowledge. In other words, it's defining itself as not the knowledge, but as something seated close to the knowledge, intimate with the knowledge. In other words, there's a relational aspect to it. It implies a certain kind of individuality, somebody who is trying to receive knowledge. And so one way of understanding it is that this is another eponymous way of defining a literature where there is a teacher and a student in close relationship with each other. So that would be the Guru-shishya parampara. But there's another way of understanding it, which is the nature of the language itself. And the language of the Upanishad is what we may call a proto-philosophical language. So this is the beginning of that kind of proto-philosophical language. A language which cuts to the bone. It really goes much closer to a close, intimate understanding of the truths that it is talking about. In that sense, it is not like a symbolic poetry, which the Veda were, you see. So that is a difference in the approach. Why that difference? My surmise is that also is because of the nature of the reform movement that is going on. Because the Veda, being so esoteric in terms of its symbol system, does not lend itself to any understanding beyond a completely closed society. It's either understood as a ritual, or if there is some other understanding to it, you need the key to that understanding. And that key cannot be had unless you belong to a certain kind of closed system. While if you start writing philosophy, you immediately make it available to everybody. You may need some interpretation or you may need some guidance, but you may also be able to get it directly. You can just read it. This is the reason why even today the Upanishads are available to us, accessible to us as texts to a much greater extent than the Veda is. So in the 8th century, or maybe a little earlier, when Shankara was doing his interpretations of the Upanishads, he could interpret them.
That's 8th century AD.
8th century AD, or CE, or however you want to call it. And of course there's controversy about that, he could be earlier than that. But nevertheless, he is interpreting it and he is authorizing himself by his interpretation of the Upanishads. Whereas the entire tradition that we may call Hindu, at that time the word did not exist. But there is still the notion of the Astika traditions. They are authorizing themselves through the Veda. So Shankara does a little hand waving and he calls his interpretations Vedic. And to do so, he introduces the term Vedanta. So the word Vedanta as the end of the Veda is really a Shankara coinage. And what it does is, his interpretation of the word end of the Veda is really also the understanding of end as the quintessence. This is a little like when we have in the Abrahamic religions, when you have Islam saying, we are the best because we are the last. It's that kind of interpretation. This is the Veda because this is the end of the Veda. We don't need to look at what went before. But when we look at the two, we realize they're not the same literature. There's a big gulf between the Veda and the Upanishad, and it's a gulf created by the Upanishad's self-perception in relation to the Veda. So we have to look at it as a separate kind of literature. And post Shankara, we find a number of teachers who today we know as the Acharyas of different lineages, most of them Vaishnava, that are interpreting the Upanishads very differently from Shankara. And so this sets up an entire tradition of interpretation of the Upanishads. The Buddha never tried to interpret the Upanishads. And it's perhaps because he was trying to create a system by itself, not something that had any relationship with the Vedic or Upanishadic system. So he did not relate. But today, we can look at the Buddha's teachings and the Upanishads and see a lot of porosity, a lot of exchange happening there. What is the nature of the philosophy, if we are going to call it a philosophy? Because today we have a certain understanding of philosophy which arises from the West, which is not the same as the kind of philosophy that we are talking about here. So, some Western thinkers even deny the possibility or the existence of philosophy in ancient India. They don't consider this to be philosophy. Because philosophy in the West is a way of thinking that tries to speculate and think about, metaphysically think about the cosmos and man's relationship with it. While they think that this is really religious thought, and religious thought has some assumptions to it. So this is the reason why some Western thinkers deny the category of philosophy to this early literature. But there is a movement within Western philosophy which is existentialism, and in existentialism there's particularly one thinker, Karl Jaspers, who has written a series on the philosophers of the world. And there, Buddha is one of the philosophers he's writing about. And in his treatment of the Buddha, he analyzes this question of what kind of philosophy is this, which can be applied also to the Upanishads. He's saying it is not the same kind of philosophy that we call philosophy. This philosophy is at the service of becoming. It is at the service of experience and becoming. So, what is it? He's saying that basically this philosophy arises out of experimental psychology. In other words, they are experimenting with themselves and arriving at certain kinds of understandings of reality, and then presenting those understandings of reality not as truths but as systems that can be used for experience. So they are pragmatic philosophies, not philosophies as systems of truth. In other words, and I think this is a very important point, it's a very deep, profound understanding. We have been, we have entered into another kind of system, and now we are applying that to understand this type of work. So we enter into metaphysical debates about whether what the Buddha was saying is true or the Upanishads are true, and what's the difference between them. Jaspers is pointing out that this is a fruitless and meaningless disputation, because the Buddha was not trying to give us an absolute truth, nor were any of these works trying to give us an absolute truth. They were giving us a viewpoint on reality, and they were saying that this viewpoint is pragmatically useful for the experience that is related to it. And the Indian tradition itself validates that, because in India what we find is that these philosophical systems are called darshanas. Darshanas cannot be thought of in isolation from yoga. Tantric texts, agamas, for example, are divided into the jnana portion, the yoga portion, and the ritual and conduct portions. This is a really important distinction between theory and practice in the Indic traditions. This is of interest to Karl Jaspers because, in a way, existentialism sets out
to privilege being and becoming over knowing. That is, we first have to build a relationship to pure being and to devise a goal of becoming. A goal of becoming is also not something that is mentally thought out right in the beginning, but something that arises through our relationship with being. And out of that, we arrive at experience. We arrive at experience through relationship to a theoretical understanding that is available to us, but also yielding new theoretical understandings. And these theoretical understandings can form the bulwark of a system which allows further experimentation and further becoming. So this kind of a relationship is something that is not the relationship between theory and practice in the West, and particularly the modern West. People like Jaspers were critiquing that and bringing to front the fact that what he calls ontology is subordinated to epistemology in Western thought and in our understanding of philosophy and today's science in Western thought. So this again is something that comes up at the turn of the 19th and 20th century when Indian yoga is making its entry into the West. We find Vivekananda, for example, making a really strong case for what you would call a subjective science to validate the views and possibilities of experience that he claimed that yoga could give us. In other words, that it is itself a tradition that can be thought of as a subjective science because it archives its experiences, and the results of its experiences are the darshanas or the philosophies. And just as in science, we move at it from a objective point of view. The scientist looks for the validation of a certain hypothesis to build a theory. So too over here, Vivekananda was pointing out that a subjective science such as yoga carries out experiments of consciousness and arrives at results which become the basis of its theories, which are philosophical theories. And these theories are then kept in an archived form in which the experiences and experiments are part of it so that they can be repeated by anybody. Just as in science, the premise is that this is an arrival at universal knowledge because one can validate through experiment and observation all the foundations of this particular theory. Here, however, it is through becoming that one validates theories that are cosmological and philosophical. And so this is a very important difference and distinction that we have to acknowledge in understanding the nature of theory or the nature of proto-philosophical language in the Upanishads. Now, talking about the difference between the Upanishads and the Veda, we also have to see that there are certain consistent elements to the Veda. And I mentioned that Sri Aurobindo begins to look at that as a way of interpreting and cracking the code, the symbolic code of the Veda. One thing that is very clear is that the Veda are giving us a solar mythology. They are really couched in a language that presupposes the existence of a solar system. And we will find that in Upanishads like the Isha Upanishad, there is a continuing reference to this solar mythology or the solar system that the Veda sets up. But they bring that in from a certain kind of background. They don't foreground it. The language is not the language of solar symbolism, but there is a reference to solar symbolism that we find throughout these Upanishads, and we'll see it throughout in the Isha Upanishad as well. So what is this solar symbolism? The foundation of the solar symbolism are two perspectives on reality. And we may call this the perspective of the sun and the perspective of the earth. And today we think that what is called a heliocentric view is a new way of looking at reality, discovered only in the 16th century by people like Copernicus, validated by people like Galileo. But in fact, a heliocentric and geocentric view of perception of the cosmos existed in India and perhaps across the world. If we really look at it, I don't think the medieval West was lacking in these two views, because these are symbolic views. These are perspectives on reality. Modernity brings in an objective reality that is restricted to material experience. And from that point of view, we can privilege a heliocentric view and say that that is the truth. But from a cosmos-psychic view, a view which is the view of consciousness and human becoming, we could take a relative perspective and look at things either from the viewpoint of the sun or from the viewpoint of the earth, or from a heliocentric and a geocentric viewpoint. We may also say that these viewpoints relate to very different kinds of experiences, and that we are subject to one of these experiences, but that we yearn or hanker after another of these experiences. And so we can see what this means if we think about the heliocentric experience. The heliocentric experience is seen from the center of the sun, and it is an experience of oneness. There is no day and night to it. There is a single light that pervades the cosmos with a center. It doesn't have any circumference, but it has a center. And that center is the helios, the sun. And we find this in the Veda. It very prominently features in a verse that continues to this day and is uttered in almost every puja that we find in modern India. It's the verse that goes, Om Tad Vishnu Paramam Padam Sada Pashyanti Suraya Diviva Chakshuratatam. And it refers to the sun as the feet or the seat, station of Vishnu, towards which the gods have their gaze turned all the time. In other words, the gods cannot turn away from this center, which is the seat of Vishnu, and it is described as an eye extended wide in heaven. So this is clearly the helios and the heliocentric view of the cosmos. In contrast with that, we have the geocentric view. And the geocentric view looked at from the earth is a view of dualities. It's a view where there are days and nights, that there are appearances and disappearances. And we see that both objectively and subjectively. We have a sense of beginnings and ends. And these beginnings and ends are both the mirroring of the rotation and revolution of the earth around the sun, as well as of our subjective experience of births, lives, and deaths that are going around in a cycle. So this has been related to two kinds of experienceable realities called
as pravritti and nivritti. Pravritti is expression, nivritti is dissolution. So every way of expressing reality is the day, and then we have later ideas of the days and nights of Brahma, or the days and nights of Vishnu. So which are time quanta. Each one of them is a certain idea that is manifesting over a certain period of time, and then folding back and coming back. Within that, there are other time quanta, which are the different ways in which days and nights are experienced by different creatures. These are all parts of the geocentric view, which is a dualistic view, a view in which we are caught, so to say. We repeat that. This idea will later be called the way of the fathers and the way of the gods, Pitriyana and Devayana. In the Gita, they talk about it. In the Upanishads, that's where it begins. They begin talking about this way of the way of the fathers and the way of the gods. The way of the gods is the heliocentric way. That is the way in which the sun is seen at all times. The way of the fathers is the round of days and nights, the round of rebirths. The Veda does not talk about rebirth, but I believe in a symbolic way, this is exactly the geocentric view is the view of rebirths. Because each life is an expression, it's folded back into a death, and then there is a repetition of life. This is how the Gita looks at Devayana and Pitriyana. That the Pitriyana is the rounds of rebirths from which we must escape to go to the heliocentric zone. The Isha Upanishad comes into that picture very interestingly. The Isha Upanishad, many of the later Upanishads field a single key idea which other Upanishads may or may not field or field to a lesser extent, but it becomes central in that Upanishad. The central idea of the Isha Upanishad is the distinction between Vidya and Avidya. And it does its own interpretation of these terms. Vidya and Avidya. This distinction is made in a number of Upanishads without very clear interpretation or elaboration. Isha Upanishad also doesn't elaborate it much. But basically, you can relate Vidya and Avidya to these two views, the heliocentric and the geocentric view. Sri Aurobindo interprets Vidya and Avidya like this. Vidya is the knowledge of the one, just like we may think about the heliocentric view. Knowledge of the one means that all the knowledge that you have is your self-knowledge. Knowledge that you have as self-knowledge, in other words, you know by experience, you know by being. If we think of our experience, we immediately see how that is not our experience. All our experience is inferential experience. We don't know anything directly except for ourselves. If we want to know about anything else, we think we know, because by observation, by collective evidence, we infer the reality of things. This is considered avidya, just as direct knowledge is considered vidya. This avidya, therefore, is a property of multiplicity, fragmentation. So we come back to the idea of the sacrifice of Purusha. Purusha before the sacrifice is the one. Purusha after the sacrifice is the multiple. Multiplicity can be thought of both in terms of space and time. In terms of space, it is multiple beings that each know themselves only as truth. Other things are known as inferred realities. Multiplicity in time is the quantization of experience. It's exactly what we were talking about with regard to births and deaths. The way we experience time, events. So time itself has become experienced as multiple, as many kinds of events, as many experiences, ultimately the experience of a life and its extinguishment. So this is the multiplication of temporality, of time. So this multiplicity is itself the basis of our existence here. This is what the Buddha was also saying, transience. Transience is an aspect of multiplicity. You see? Now, therefore there was the attempt, and it is natural for a world in which multiplicity exists, to erase that multiplicity. Because multiplicity is discomfort. In terms of space itself, it's discomfort, because each person feels their own reality, all other realities are felt to be alien. And that alienation is something we have to negotiate throughout our lives. We do it through language, and we do it through various forms of distancing and reducing distance in our dealings with each other, trying to understand each other, etc. So there is a natural tendency to collapse the multiplicity into the oneness. And the whole history of humanity can be seen as an attempt to do that. Religions are an attempt to do that. Each religion is saying there is one, and your experience of the multiple can be reduced to that one. The problem is that everyone who says that creates a certain idea of the one that tries to tame the infinity of the many. It tries to bring the infinity under that one. But every such idea of unity is different from other such ideas of unity. And therefore we go back to the multiplicity. Our ideas of unity themselves are multiple. They belong to the multiplicity. This is partly the reason why philosophy in the West today, which is what we call postmodernism, is not focused on the one. It exists to preserve the multiplicity. That is its very purpose, to preserve the multiplicity. In Sri Aurobindo's reading, the Isha Upanishad is telling us we should preserve the multiplicity, but we should also experience the unity. This is a very difficult proposition. The difficulty of this proposition comes from the fact that the mind operates according to the law of the excluded middle. The law of the excluded middle, or the law of non-contradiction, is that if A is true, not A cannot be true. If the one is true, not one cannot be true. If the many is true, the not many cannot be true. This kind of view can only be exceeded if we completely get out of the realm of mind. But if we get out of the realm of mind, we've lost the world. So as a problem of becoming, if we take this as a problem of becoming, we have to know the one and the many at the same time. This problem of becoming goes beyond the mind. It is not a problem of becoming that is available to us as an organization of consciousness that has mind. This is why he coins the term supermind. Supermind for him is a kind of consciousness that exceeds the law of the excluded middle. And can we experience that? The whole idea of the Upanishads is that reality is infinite, radically infinite. And that whatever you pose to yourself as a goal of becoming, you can become. So you can go beyond your present limitations by experiment of consciousness if you pose the right problem. And so that becomes the entire idea of the yoga of Sri Aurobindo, And that is, in a nutshell, what he tries to read into the Isha Upanishad.